Everyone, this is Lecture 6 for California Labor, Agriculture, Alien Land Laws, and Unequal Citizenship. I expect that you've already read both the John Steinbeck readings as well as the Karen Leonard readings for this week, and that you can begin to capture or understand some of the experiences of those who work in agriculture. And I think there are a number of questions that should arise as you're reading those pieces. Number one is, particularly when you think about the John Steinbeck pieces, which is what has changed and what remains the same. I think the second question would be around how do the experiences of these different groups in agriculture, how are some of them similar and how are some of them different? What role does race and class play in the experiences of these workers? And I think third, we want to begin to investigate how laws play a very central role in inequality. In today's lecture, we're going to do a brief overview of Asian Americans in agriculture. We'll focus specifically on the alien land laws here in California, as well as discrimination and unequal citizenship. I want to start first with the Chinese in agriculture, and I know that we've already begun to talk about the Chinese, particularly as it related to both the gold rush and the completion of the railroads. But what we do know is that when the Chinese first came here to the United States, they expected to participate as part of the gold rush here in California. But the gold rush, by the time the Chinese arrived, was largely over, the greater proportion of the Chinese population coming in 1848, 49, 50. And this was already at the tail end of the gold rush. And the Chinese men basically became workers that took on the jobs that many others did not want. So in some cases, this was the railroads and minings. And as you'll see here, agriculture and fisheries were a very big part of the Chinese work in the United States in general, but particularly here in California. Here in California, they were migrant farm laborers working working in different spaces and places depending on the season, whether it was tomatoes and peaches and oranges or grapes, but they moved wherever the harvesting was needed. They were also sharecroppers and tenant farmers, as well as that they were very innovative in terms of working in canneries, fisheries, and marine industries. As you'll see throughout this presentation, I've pulled some historic pictures. Most of these came from the Bancroft Archive. And this is a picture of the Chinese cutting lettuce in the fields of California. And I tried to pull these historic pictures just to give you a flavor, if you will, of what that work was like. And I would also imagine that as you're looking at some of these photographs, that it doesn't look that different from something you drive by on the 5 as you're going north, right here from Los Angeles, or even as you go to inland into Riverside or Temecula. These scenes, these pictures, although taken in the early 1900s, could still be seen today. And that's something to think about. I think it's also important to note that despite hostility and discrimination, the Chinese continued to immigrate to California to avail themselves of whatever opportunities awaited them. And when they were prevented from becoming miners, they became merchants, laborers, or sought employment elsewhere. And I think that what we begin to see is that because most were non-citizens, they were prevented by owning land a lot by local laws. So while we'll talk about later is state laws, but local laws also prohibited specifically the Chinese from owning land. But they were also very significant in the development of California land. So, for example, they reclaimed swampland in the Sacramento Delta, and many of them raised vegetables and fruit that they sold door to door. And others when they served as sharecroppers and tenant farmers who leased and paid the landlord for part of their crop. Most were migrant farm laborers, though, and these Chinese farm laborers were essential to developing various crops that required special skill and care, such as harvesting and processing olives. Chinese immigrants also provided essential labor that were part of the development of the wine industry in California. Sorry, I clicked over to the slide a little too soon. So just so you know, a lot of that went with the previous slide. In terms of the fishing industry, they were very instrumental in developing the fishing communities throughout California, especially in Monterey, San Diego, and San Luis Obispo. The Chinese inhabitants helped develop the industry for squid, abalone, shrimp, sturgeon, and other kinds of fish. They also processed kelp and a variety of other marine products. And by the late 1880s, There were over 2,000 Chinese in fishing camps throughout the San Francisco Bay, Monterey, and San Diego areas. The Chinese fishermen ran into antagonism from white fishermen who pressured the California legislature with passing restrictions on Chinese fishing activities, which caused hardship for the communities and eventually the decline of the Chinese in these industries. And it is important to note that these early laws, when we're talking about these laws prohibiting Chinese in the fishing industry, were in fact designed for the Chinese. And that these early laws really did target very specific ethnic groups. I think here I want to enter into, well, while I'm not giving you a full-blown history of Asian Americans in agriculture, I'm kind of giving you highlights. I think part of what you're developing here is a picture. And I encourage for those guys who are really interested in these things to take an Asian American Studies class, which can provide you with a much deeper, in-depth history of all of these different things. But in terms of the Japanese and agriculture, by 1890, the Japanese had moved into agricultural work, particularly in the Vacaville area and Solano County. What we do know via public records is that Japanese had been buried in Visalia Public Cemetery in Tulare County, and labor contractors were beginning to gather new immigrants to work in a number of industries such as railroads, oil fields, and agriculture. So this is 1890 to 1900. By 1900, Southern California had a Japanese population of approximately 500 people, with the largest concentration in Los Angeles County. But already the immigrants had begun efforts to establish themselves. We know Ulysses Shinsei Kaneko, for example, became one of the first Japanese naturalized in California in San Bernardino County in 1896. Businesses in towns and cities had been in operation for almost a decade, with Buddhist churches and Japanese Christian churches being established much earlier. Japanese had purchased property, and there were a number of Nisei children that were born. Nisei being the second generation, meaning that they were also U.S. citizens. And it's during this time period that if you go through the historic records between 1900 and 1910, you begin to see a lot of land purchases, many of whom established farms and vineyards and orchards, really putting a foothold in the agricultural industry. The picture depicted on this slide was the Yamato colony in Merced, California in about 1911. The Yamato colony was one of the largest here in California and was very, very influential in terms of agricultural circles, and was very successful in terms of selling their crops. By 1920, the Japanese had firmly established themselves in agriculture and many of its offshoots. And those offshoots included wholesaling, retailing, and distribution. The Japanese organized their produce and flour industries vertically, resulting in a system in which all operations were owned and operated by the Japanese, from raising the plants to retail sales. This resulted in organizations such as the Southern California Flour Market in Los Angeles, the California Flour Market in San Francisco, Lucky Produce in Sacramento, and the City Market in Los Angeles. Cooperatives like Nature Ripe in Watsonville and Santa Cruz County were organized to improve the growing, packing, and marketing of crops produced by Japanese farmers. So if you think about, and any of you guys who have been to the downtown Los Angeles area, we know that the California Flour Mart, for example, is still the center by which all flours are produced and distributed throughout LA and surrounding counties. If you look at this picture here, you'll realize that this is actually First Street. This is actually in Little Tokyo here in Los Angeles. And this is First Street right about 1 or 2 blocks west of the First and Alameda intersection. In fact, you should recognize some of those buildings for those guys who have been to Little Tokyo here in California. And part of the reason I point this out is to talk about really the historic legacy that these communities have in California, and that these communities, like Little Tokyo, were part of a history of work in the region. What we do know is that by 1940, the census shows little change from the 1930 figures. During this decade, the Japanese population of California decreased from approximately 97,500 to about 93,000. Although a few counties like Los Angeles continue to increase, it's during the years of 1942 to 1945, the Japanese Americans were interned in concentration camps. And so this is one of the reasons we begin to see such a low population in these areas. I think it's important to note that as we'll talk about a little bit later, that many who were dispossessed of their land as a result of internment, um, some returned and others did not. Those who did return had to rebuild their lives that had been dramatically altered by the concentration camp experience. In some communities, one third or more of the Japanese population did not return. Moreover, many did not survive, many having died while being incarcerated in those concentration camps. Non-Japanese businesses and residents had moved into sections of town previously occupied by Japanese Americans. And the war was also a turning point in generational control of businesses, churches, and community politics, as the adult children of immigrants began to dominate all spheres of Japanese activity. So you also began to see a change in power and power dynamics in the community. I think one of the more important things to think about, particularly because the Alien Land Laws really happened between 1913. You saw the Alien Land Laws start in 1913, and again in 1920 it was strengthened, but it was really not enforced until the 1940s, 1943 through 45. I think it's important to think about what are some of the reasons why. Part of this was economic success of the Japanese. You had vertical integration, which was the ability of the Japanese to control specific agricultural markets. These things created animosity because effectively shut out all non-Japanese from profiting in these markets. If you are able to own all parts of the production process, from planting to the distribution and sales, it means that you could also lower your cost. If you think about it, this would be the Walmart model that is now in use, right? Where Walmart owns all part of the production process. They may subcontract to farmers, but because they are such a big conglomerate, they can drive down the cost of everything. Let's say bananas, for example, to a cost where farmers barely make any profit. Walmart owns all their own trucks, their own flights. They're able to bring it into their own stores. Within their own stores, they control all distribution. So this is how they're able to lower costs. Well, this is not a new model. In fact, this was a model that was very successfully put in place by the Japanese, but it also created a lot of animosity among workers in California because it meant that it drove down prices, right? The Japanese could cut overhead costs and deliver the same quality product at a much cheaper price. The business successes played a significant role in the passage of the Alien Land Laws because it was the other growers and other farmers who were not vertically integrated that started pressuring legislators to change laws, right? And one of the first laws they were able to pass was this Alien Land Law. So you have the California Alien Land Law of 1913. This law prohibited aliens ineligible for citizenship, hence Japanese aliens, from acquiring, processing, enjoying, or transferring real property or any interest therein except to the extent prescribed by existing treaties. Now, when we're talking about existing treaties, this was really the treaty of this was the Treaty of 1911, right? Which was between the U.S. government and Japan. While there was nothing in that treaty that explicitly prohibited Japanese from buying land, they were being very careful during this particular time period. So in 1911, prior to this 1913 Alien Land Law, the California legislative session passed a bill prohibiting land ownership by aliens not eligible for citizenship by a vote of 29-3. Actually, I should say the Senate passed that by a vote of 29-3, but it died in committee in the Assembly. Presidential intervention was instrumental in killing this bill. Opposition also came from the Panama Pacific Exposition Company and supporters who feared the effect of the measure upon Japan's participation. So here we begin to see that foreign policy played a very significant role in 1911 of really suppressing the first Alien Land Law. But in 1913, that wasn't the case, and they were able to actually pass this law through the legislature. In addition to the individual prohibitions, they also had a similar prohibition applied to corporations, a majority of whose members were ineligible aliens, or a majority of who issued capital stock was owned by such aliens. An exception was made permitting the lease of land for agricultural purposes for a term not to exceed 3 years, land already owned by ineligible citizens, aliens, or acquired in satisfaction of existing liens that might be retained. I think the important thing to note here is this line that says land already owned by ineligible aliens. Here they were really very carefully walking a tight wire, where this land law, if they did not have that line in it, would also have dispossessed many white immigrants from their lands at the time. And so they were very careful that this was something that they were looking to the future in terms of trying to implement. Then we have the California Alien Land Law of 1920, which actually built upon the 1913 law. It was prior to this, the governor requested that the State Board of Control basically do a study looking at the leasing of land in California. In this 1919 report, the report only dealt with Japanese, Chinese, and Hindus. It dwelt only briefly upon Hindus who were negligible in number, and the Chinese who, the report concluded, were generally engaged in small commercial enterprises and could not be considered a menace because of the Chinese Exclusion Acts. Nearly an entire report was given over to the quote-unquote Japanese problem: population, birth rate, land ownership and control, financing, labor, and the fishing industry, immigration, etc. Aliens and citizens were lumped together in figures on population and land ownership, and much of the emphasis was placed on the allegedly high birth rate of the Japanese. When we talk about the alleged high birth rate of the Japanese, what we look at here is the growing number of Japanese citizens. And so this report really directly painted a picture of the Japanese being a threat to the California economy because of the land that they owned and the foothold that they were gaining in the agricultural industry. Again, we go back to the vertical integration piece here. Now, the Alien Land Law of 1920 enacted further restrictions. It prohibited the transfer of land to non-citizens by sale or lease. In other words, other farmers could not sell to aliens, to non-citizens or aliens ineligible for citizenship. Aliens were not eligible for citizenship could not hold land in guardianship for their children. So before, it used to be that you could put the land in the name of your children and still work that land. Here they were prohibiting that. This was, as you know from the Leonard reading, a strategy that had been used by numerous different immigrant groups to circumvent the land laws. If it was determined that the land was purchased in one person's name, but with money from an Asian alien, the land would automatically become state property. Now, what's really interesting about these laws, though, was the enforcement of the land laws. It was when you go through the historic record between 1913 and 1940, seldomly enforced, with 3 different sites reporting less than 80 different cases where this was invoked. Where you began to see the enforcement of the alien land laws was really around the time of World War II, which is not necessarily surprising when you think about it. And that these enforcements were definitely tied to foreign politics at the time. Clearly, the Japanese being considered enemy combatants and a group that was very dangerous to the United States. And what we began to see here is the state's power to seize alien property holdings under the Citizen Land Act was strengthened by 2 bills by Governor Earl Warren. One bill removes the time limit on the state's prosecution of cases under the 1920 laws. In other words, we know that most laws have a statute of limitation. You see this in laws regarding the prosecution of rape, that in order to be prosecuted, you need to be arrested within a particular time frame. We see this about grand theft. We know that, for example, murder has no statute of limitations. So here, by removing this time limit on the 1920 law, it opened up many, particularly Japanese property owners, to being prosecuted under this 1920 law. The second bill also gave the Attorney General power to instruct district attorneys to assist in alien land law cases. In other words, that district attorneys could also bring these cases forth. This was part of an article that was written by the Watsonville Register Pajaronian, which is a newspaper in the Central Coast, on July 11th in 1945. This particular set of laws were instrumental in taking away the property of Japanese while they were being interned. It is really important to note that while they were in concentration camps, they were dispossessed of their lands. We also know that land is very central to wealth accumulation in the United States. That when we're trying to figure out how wealthy an individual is, you look at their income, you add their assets, which are things like stocks and bonds and property, and then you subtract debt. And so when you take away land, you're taking away a group's assets. We also know that property also tends to accumulate value over time. Now, by taking away the land of the land from Japanese, we dispossess their families of wealth. So what we began to see during this time period in the mid-1940s is that you had district attorneys throughout the state who began prosecuting. Here in Los Angeles County, the Board of Supervisors formally supported the LA District Attorney's filing of legal action against all Japanese in an effort to return Japanese property to the state. Irregardless of the fact that these Japanese families, in some cases, the property belonged were in the names of their citizen children, the Nisei, the second generation, or were put in the guardianship of white allies. In Salinas and Monterey, there were also 2 court petitions which successfully were filed to prosecute Japanese farm owners. This happened throughout the state, and it was really a dark period in terms of really targeting one particular group and dispossessing them both of power and privileges and resources. The end of the alien land laws. I think it's important to note that the 14th Amendment played a very crucial role here, and numerous legal scholars have written on this particular piece. The U.S. Supreme Court, in the case of Oyama versus California, upheld Fred Oyama's right as a U.S.-born citizen to own property, even though his father had purchased the land in his name in order to get around California's alien land law. They found that under the equal protection, that as a citizen he had the right to own that land, that it would be no different from another individual who was white and a citizen having their parents buy them property in their name, that they were afforded protections. In 1952, the U.S. Supreme Court invalidated the remaining alien land laws in the case of Seifuji versus California, which determined that court case, they determined that forbidding aliens from owning land was a violation of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. So these two court cases were instrumental in bringing an end to the alien land laws. I think it's also important to note that in terms that while we've had these laws, and as you read in the Leonard piece, immigrants didn't just stay passively bought. They weren't passive victims. And I think that's an important lesson that can be obscured among all the law in the history. What you began to see is that immigrants became very creative in circumventing these alien land laws that they felt were unfair. And dispossessed them, or aimed to dispossess them of lands that they felt that they had worked hard to obtain. So there were numerous strategies, and just a few, and I would expect you to fill out this list, but just a few of the ways in which they circumvented these alien land laws included purchasing property in their children's name. In other words, their second-generation children were citizens of the United States and afforded different rights. And so they often purchased property in the name of their children. They often asked white allies to hold land in stewardship. We know that in some cases this was very successful, and these partnerships were very fruitful for both parties. And in some cases, some allies were excellent. We're doing this in a very We're doing this out of a matter of fairness and human rights. But as you read in the Leonard pieces, this wasn't always the case. In some cases, you also had both Japanese and the Asian Indians who were dispossessed of their land because the land wasn't officially in their name, and they lost their legal battles. So we understand that in some cases this was a great strategy, and in others it wasn't. But I think just as importantly, the alien land laws came to an end because the Japanese, in particular, were unafraid to file lawsuits challenging the validity of the law, right? And that's how those alien land laws came to an end, by the willingness to use the court system to challenge and to fight for their rights, to point out discrimination or forms of unequal citizenship as they existed. So you should be able to, after both this lecture and the readings for this week, think about how were the California alien land laws an example of unequal citizenship. You should be able to go through, here I'm just reminding you so you don't have to go back to your early lectures, that unequal citizenship refers to the ways in which rights, resources, and privileges are distributed unequally across different social groups, categories, and geographies. So here, what we can begin to understand that if you're going to do an analysis of unequal citizenship, some of the questions you may want to answer is, were all individuals property regardless of race and gender subject to these alien land laws? What motivated the passage and enforcement of these laws? And how did these laws create or maintain a stratification system based on race and class? So I invite you to think about these questions, and these are going to be questions that I continue to ask you throughout class. But as I've gone through this lecture, part of what I've pointed out are areas where the Japanese were singled out. And at a point where any individual or group is singled out, we begin to understand that that is often the seed of inequality, right? So, in the case of the Japanese, what we have to remember here is you have a mixed group of immigrants, some of which are citizens, others of which are not. We begin to understand that the motivation behind these laws were not altruistic, and while they might be hidden under the guise of patriotism, in fact, they were actually to help other groups gain economically. These are the underpinnings of stratification. This is some of the ways in which some groups gain privileges while others do not. And I invite you to think about these things, and we'll continue to have these discussions as we move through these agriculture pieces.